Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the last of our short series on the life of Elisha. I've really enjoyed looking at this Old Testament character, and I hope that you, like me, have learned something more about the ancient faith in which we participate. I also hope that some learnings have come to you through the series. This final story that we look at today takes place some 43 years or so after the last story that we looked at. You might remember in that story, the Aramean kingdom was taken over by Hazael in a coup. In the intervening period, some 40 years or so, there has been much bloodshed as various kings have come to the throne in Israel and Judah. They fought with each other, they fought with Aram and some other kingdoms, and in order to eliminate any potential threats, there are some horrendous stories that you can read there in the chapters in 2 Kings. But it's pretty gory and unattractive reading in some ways. So now we come to the final event of Elisha's life, which is recounted in the Bible. He was probably over 80 years of age at this stage, and the king of Israel, Jehoash, seeks him out to find out whether the Israeli army can finally defeat the armies of Aram. And this is actually a real faith event, because his father, the previous king, had just died, and the army was pretty decimated at this stage. So we read from 2 Kings chapter 13. I'm starting at verse 14. Now Elisha had been suffering from the illness from which he died. Jehoash, king of Israel, went down to see him and wept over him. My father, he cried, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. Elisha said, get a bow and some arrows. And so he did. Take the bow in your hands, he said to the king of Israel. When he had taken it, Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. Open the east window, he said, and he opened it. Shoot, Elisha said, and he shot. The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram, Elisha declared. You will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek. Then he said, take the arrows, and the king took them. Elisha told him, strike the ground. He struck it 3 times and stopped. The man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. But now you will defeat it only 3 times. Elisha died and was buried. Now Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders. So they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. Not the most respectful of funerals. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. What an end to Elisha. Like Daniel, Elisha served God faithfully at a national level for many years. Also, like Daniel, we read of dramatic events and God's amazing intervention when it seemed all was lost. However, even though Elisha is recorded as having performed more than twice the amount of miracles as Elijah, even one after he was dead, there were days, months, and presumably years when nothing too dramatic happened. Some kings may have liked him or trusted him better than others. No doubt some kings were threatened by him, but he stayed faithful and at his post throughout the years. We can be tempted as we read these stories to think that the lives of these great men and women of God were all lived on some sort of a spiritual high, where they never had to deal with the ordinary and mundane things of life? Well, they did. We just don't read about it because the stories actually form a part of a much bigger story. For Elisha, it was the part he played in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah during the years they continued to defy God and worship Baal, at least most of the time. He was God's voice to the people. We are also called to be God's voice in the world in which we live. As we read through the chapters of 2 Kings, some of the narrative is difficult. There's lots of blood and gore, as I just said. And the people who were seeking after power were so crazed and power hungry that often they would do anything to get power or retain it. What we find in these stories is that the kings of the earth stand in stark contrast to the King of Kings, because the one thing that Elisha and the other prophets continually preach about is the mercy of God. If only the people would turn back. If only they would relent from the worship of pagan false gods to the one true God and turn to the one true God who would take them back in his arms like a spurned lover. Much of the imagery used by the prophets in the Bible is of a broken relationship between a faithful husband and a wayward wife. The justice and judgment of God is heavily weighted with mercy. In the story we've just read, King Jehoash describes Elisha as father, a great honour, and cries out the chariots and horsemen of Israel. Perhaps he was both honouring Elisha for the many times he had saved Israel in war, and also acknowledging that he is, as Elijah was, the prophet of God who will be taken to heaven too. You'll remember that dramatic ending to Elijah's life when he was scooped up by in a fiery chariot. Also, maybe he was making the point or acknowledging the fact that for all the armies and the power that they had, actually, that none of that was as important as having God on their side. By putting his hands in the king's hands, Elisha signifies that God is with him and is with the Israeli army. In the previous part of the chapter, we read the army had been decimated by Hazael's men and is down to a fraction of the size required to defeat a vastly superior army. However, the king knows that the odds are very different when God is on his side. You know, it's no different today. If we've learned anything from the stories of Elisha, it's that everything changes when God intervenes on our behalf. We need to be people of prayer and faith and do what God instructs us to do. We don't always get the results that we want. And sometimes when we read these stories, it seems like we just have to do certain things and we can influence God to give us a very particular result. But we do have to be faithful in prayer. In the story, the king is a bit half-hearted and only gets part of the blessing. It's temporary. He'll defeat the Aramean army 3 times, but not entirely. We too need to hold out in prayer, to continue on day by day, not losing heart, not growing tired of doing good. It's not always easy, but it is what we are called to do. Finally, I'm glad that the story of how Elisha's bones resurrected a man when having been thrown into Elisha's grave, and when his body then touched Elisha's skeleton is recounted in the Bible. For Elisha's legacy lived on long after he had died. Let me encourage those of you who wonder perhaps as you come towards the latter years of your life, what will I leave behind? We all want to leave some sort of legacy, I imagine. Well, your skeleton may not raise somebody else to life, but your words, your love, and your faith may well have helped someone towards eternal life. We may never know who we have influenced or touched over the years. Blessing others is not a sport that is limited to younger men and women. God never puts us on a pile that's entitled useless. God always has something for us to do, lives to touch, even in the mundane parts of our existence. Thanks for joining me over the past many weeks as I sign off from this little studio here in the church for a while. So as I sign off on this series, may the Lord bless you and use you for the building of his kingdom. Amen.